This weekend, I have a habit of trying to go for a therapeutic run to downtown Nashville. And as I was running down to downtown Nashville, I passed by one of the icons, the Ryman Auditorium. Now, the Ryman Auditorium, for those of you who don't know, was built in the 1890s. It's a church that was later converted to a performance hall. And in all the downtown high-rise coming up, it's this wonderful brick classic building. Within 1 block of the Ryman, there are 3 large aerial cranes that surround it. That doesn't even talk about the 5 to 6 block radius, but within a block of the Ryman, you have 3 aerial cranes. So yesterday, I was just driving into Indianapolis. I was always struck by what a great city this is, great planning. The Colts Stadium is close by, the baseball stadium, which actually I can see through the back door, which is walking distance from the riverfront, which is close to the State Museum. But do you know what's missing from Indianapolis? Aerial cranes. And so this is part of what we're going to talk about today. It's really the impact of a tremendous population shift to the southeast and to the southwest, and what this means for states as they plan for their infrastructure growth. Today, we're going to focus on a couple of states as a case study, Georgia and Texas. But first, so you can have some understanding of who I am and our firm is, I want to just give you a little bit of overview of who TRG is. So we give the Wall Street perspective to CII. We are an equity research and advisory firm focused only on the construction and industrial sectors. We advise the largest hedge funds, mutual funds, and private equity funds from across the US and the globe. Collectively, we manage over $1 trillion in funding. So we essentially help them decide what stocks are good stocks to buy or sell in these spaces. We help them advise them in specific business decisions from a consulting standpoint, and at times we help them decide what companies they should buy or occasionally sell. So what would be of interest to you is we do 8 different industry surveys. We're happy to share the feedback for any of these. We do these on a quarterly basis. But we think about the world in terms of 3 broad buckets: res, non-res, and public construction. And we care about all the things that go into it. So I have a particular love for rocks. If you want to talk to me about wallboard, I can keep you bored for at least a good hour or 2. If you want to know anything about the resurgence of LVT and why ceramic is going to be a dying phase with a labor shortage, I can talk about that too. And in case you're wondering, one of the surveys we do is an RV dealer survey. We're not going to talk about it today, but just for those out there, if you want to know the best canary in the coal mine from an economic standpoint, is the RV industry. So we take a very bottoms-up view and really try to get our hands into the dirt. We're not the Wall Street types that just read 10Ks and 10Qs and listen to what management says. We're out in the field trying to talk to everyone so we can understand what that landscape is. Well, the first thing we want to do is just set the table and talk about that population trends and how it's been moving to the southeast and to the southwest. Now, I don't think it is a surprise to anyone. There has been a population shift for quite some time to these parts, to southeast and southwest, for the past 20 to 30 years. But since the Great Recession, you've seen an acceleration of this trend. And many of you, especially those of you from the great state of Texas, have seen this in particular in certain cities. I'm based in Nashville. We certainly have been living through those pains. So if you look, 7 of the top 20 growth states are located in the southeast and the southwest. But another way to think about it is the have-nots. And 15 of the bottom 20 population growth states are in the northeast and the northwest. So this begs the question, why is there a population shift? What's driving this? And I'm going to kind of go back to the 90s with Clinton. And he said, it's the economy. Stupid. And it gets down to taxes. So taxes have played a pivotal role for certain states in terms of attracting business. States with no personal income tax, such as Texas, Florida, and Tennessee, have all benefited. And in general, states that focus on having a business-friendly environment have benefited and will continue to benefit. Favorable labor laws certainly have also helped. We certainly know with the rising cost of labor, organized labor is generally less prevalent in the Southeast and the Southwest, and there are certain industries that have found this attractive. Lower cost of living, certainly, in these areas. For temperate climates, I know some of you may say, what does weather have to do with a move? But I assure you, you spend some time with some people who've moved major headquarters, they say once you go warm, you don't go back to the cold. And then finally, this one it's obscure, but it's not obscure, but we we strongly believe this is going to be another meaningful growth driver for the area, and it's an expansion of the Panama Canal. So the Panama Canal expansion was completed about 2 years ago. As with any good construction project, it was over budget and over time. But the post-Panamax ships can carry 2.5 to 3 times the amount of goods than the prior Panamax ships. What does that mean? That means that there's an expected diversion of goods from the West Coast. Up to 20 to 30% of goods can end up showing up in the Gulf and then along the Southeast and the Eastern corridor. So there's certain industrial markets that will benefit and that already are benefiting from that. The Port of Savannah, which we'll talk about a little bit more, are already seeing benefits from this. But the fascinating thing, what most people don't know, is that there were only 2 ports that were ready to accept these post-Panamax ships. Savannah was a third, and so as you have additional ports build out to just even accept these large ships, we expect to see additional flow of goods, and that's going to be another catalyst for growth in this region. As you know, that major headquarters have been influxing into the Southeast. The former governor of Tennessee was very famous in saying, Detroit may be Motor City, but Tennessee is the Motor State. So you've had Nissan and Toyota move to Tennessee and to Texas. You have tech move south to Georgia. You've had Alliance Bernstein, which in my world is riveting. You have this bastion of investing moving from Midtown Manhattan to little old Nashville, Tennessee. And it's not just the back office, it's the CEO, it's the CFO, it's the investment group. These are major corporations that are spending the capital and uprooting their employees to move to the Southeast and the Southwest. So for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to focus on 2 states, Texas and Georgia. Texas has no state income tax, very business-friendly state. It's a state that has diversified, not just all about energy, but they have a strong presence in tech, healthcare, also have had a good presence in building out in the auto industry. Georgia, also a business-friendly state, admittedly not as favorable a tax structure, but still nonetheless very good state, lower cost of living. They have a great access with the Port of Savannah, which is going to be an important gateway for the Panama Canal, but also have a strong presence in education, tech, and many other industries. If there's one takeaway that you have for this talk, it would be this. It's not that we need to build more infrastructure because you have people moving. It's what states are doing to prepare for this. And the big takeaway that I'd like to have is they got tired of waiting for the Fed to meet their funding needs. Perhaps one of the most revolutionary things that states have done have said, I can't wait for the federal government to reauthorize a multi-year highway bill. There were literally 8 years of continuing resolutions for a long-term highway bill. And states just got tired of waiting, and then they got creative. So in order to meet the needs that were previously being left unmet by the Fed, and keep in mind the Fed accounts for at least 50 to 60% of any transportation funding, many said, I'm going to take a different road, no pun intended, and think about more creative ways how to fund. So if you look in the past 60 months, 31 states have passed meaningful changes in overall infrastructure funding, 7 in 2017 alone. And these are from Democratic and Republican-led states. This is a bipartisan issue. But what we love about it is the types of funding solutions they're coming up with are very different. It's not just a gas tax increase. They're coming up with a hotel tax. They're establishing floors for gas taxes. They're eliminating the rating of the state departments of transportation. They're even directing funds from general fund to DOTs. In short, they're not just coming up with one single solution. They're coming up with a much richer solution overall. I bring this state up just to point out, the lighter blue are some of the states that passed in 2017, but really the purpose of this is also to point about how much peer pressure has really pushed forward some of these initiatives. Georgia did something very interesting in 2014 and 2015 because Florida had done something in the prior year. Tennessee did something because all the headlines that Georgia got. Georgia also was influenced by Virginia. South Carolina did something because they were sandwiched by both Georgia and Virginia had done interesting things. We are now already hearing that Alabama, which had long lagged and has struggled with coming up with alternative funding, is very close to coming with its own funding solution. So what started out as some revolutionary states are really putting a stake into the ground, it's becoming a domino effect of other states that are increasing funding. So let's look at Georgia as a first case study. So Georgia, what's not on this slide, is Georgia attempted to pass a gas tax increase, and it failed miserably. So they went back to the drawing board and said, well, let's do a study and let's really determine what is the shortfall. And they determined the shortfall was $1 billion to $1.5 billion just to meet the existing needs of their state roads. So in the spring of 2015, they passed House Bill 170. And the brilliant thing about House Bill 170 is they took this cafeteria approach. They phased out a gas tax. They raised the excise tax for both gas and gasoline and diesel. They placed fees on heavy trucks. They also, instead of getting a tax credit for electric cars, they recognize a car is a car, whether it's using gas, diesel, or it's electric. You still have to pay, so you have a fee on electric cars. One of my personal favorites is the hotel tax. So anytime you stay in the state of Georgia, $5 per night goes directly towards new road construction in that state. So it was implemented in 2015. As with time, it typically takes 18 to 24 months before those dollars hit the road. But in short, this has resulted in roughly a doubling of the overall budget. This is a nice visual that shows kind of a before and after, but these are real dollars that are funding real projects. Just from the excise tax change alone, you have a nearly 70% increase in the actual monthly fuel tax collections in the state of Georgia. Now, figures 3 and 4 are the charts I'd really like you more to focus on because this really gives you, it's great that you have the funding, but one of the issues with these big increases in funding is the dollars haven't been actually hitting the road. There's been delays in engineering and the letting process, and you can come up with your excuse. But in terms of engineering and design contracts, real engineering design contracts, since it passed in 2015, we've had a 114% increase. In terms of the value of dollars, it's over 100%. And so these are projects that are really funding through, and it would not have been possible had it not been for the state of Georgia coming up with more creative funding methods and not just waiting for the Fed to bail them out. So where does Georgia stand today? Still have a good growth in the economy, 4% revenue collections up fiscal 18. The most recent data as we were heading into this conference is fuel tax collections are up 74%. Because of the importance of the Port of Savannah, the state of Georgia is talking about building the nation's first truck-only access highway from the Port of Savannah to Atlanta, which is estimated to be about $2 billion in overall value. Next case study is Texas. As is everything in Texas, everything's bigger, including their funding shortfall. So if you have $1 billion to $1.5 billion in Georgia, that's going to be $5 billion in Texas. And TxDOT has long struggled with their Texas-sized funding gap. But Governor-elect George Abbott, when he was going to office, said this is going to be one of his top priorities to address. And essentially, since 2016, there have been 3 measures that have passed that have had a meaningful impact to Texas funding. Proposition 1, Proposition 7, the elimination of TxDOT transfers. What's interesting about all of these is there were no new taxes raised. We'll go a little bit into Prop 1 and Prop 7, but the long and the short, these initiatives are likely to have closed and more likely will surpass the funding gap by fiscal 20. So Proposition 1, and I put, how like the 80% yes vote. This is a non-controversial vote. But essentially, funds are collected from oil and natural gas production taxes. The other thing that the state of Texas did is they were very specific in how the dollars can be spent. It's not for salaries, it's not for studies, it's for real construction. So right-of-way, new roads, and maintenance. As I said earlier, the interesting thing about this is no new taxes were raised with Prop 1. Proposition 7 really focuses more on the health of Texas and harnessing on the health of the state of Texas. The state of Texas operates on a biennial budget, and the basic gist of this is $2.5 billion will be transferred from the state's general fund account if the state revenue collections surpass $28 billion. Once that's passed, you can put the $2.5 billion into their TxDOT funding. Transfers begin in calendar 17, which is their fiscal 18. Once again, no new taxes. It's really more a shifting of dollars into the TxDOT funding. Once again, what does that mean for Texas? If you look kind of a similar side-by-side with Texas versus Georgia, it has a real meaningful impact. And really, granted, it's having a greater impact in 19 and 20. But still, you're seeing some major highway projects that would not have been possible without this type of funding. To date, fundings are up 25% in fiscal 18 alone. If you look at May, June, and July lettings, they have averaged about $1 billion. This is versus last year's lettings. It was around $450 million rather. You've had a meaningful increase in oil and gas collections, up over 50%. And the current state tax collections is about $31.5 billion, so that $2.5 billion is pretty set. The one caveat I have for this, we've had a lot of dollars, we have a lot of states that have done some interesting things in terms of funding, and this is a part we'll get into when we get into some of TRG's quarterly industry surveys, it's been a little slow to get the dollars to the road because of a variety of different issues. Labor being a big one, lettings, and all the things that can hold up a project delay. Texas, for instance, hired over 300 people just to meet the engineering needs for all the projects they were starting to let up. So if you were to talk to some of the largest aggregate producers in Texas, Martin Marietta, Vulcan Materials, Summit Materials, they would have said last year was kind of disappointing because we would have thought more new roads would have been starting to be built. But that was because of people. So let's started chatted with you earlier in the presentation, we do a wide variety of industry surveys. The two that I want to focus on start at the very beginning of the construction value chain, bonding and contractors, and one that's a little bit farther along, a building products survey. On the bonding and contractor side, most everyone is pretty optimistic. If I look at what's driving demand today, it's healthcare, office, tech, highway roads, multifamily, but I would say it's really more a beltway, not city center. But if I look at the biggest change this year versus last year, it's visibility in non-res and commercial construction. So last year, a year ago, April, one of the largest national commercial contractors in the US said, Kathryn, we've got the biggest backlogs we have ever had in the company's history. I don't know how we're going to do business. And it's like, that's great. Gives you a lot of visibility. Then I get to December, and I get the same call from the same guy. He's like, Kathryn, we've got the biggest backlogs in our company's history. And I was like, I already know that. You told me that 6 months ago. He's like, no, it's a little bit different. I want to meet with you, and I want to talk about two things. I want to talk about why my bidding activity went up so much at the end of 2017, and I'm a little concerned about availability of certain building product materials and some of the price increases coming, and I don't want to be kept flat-footed. Can we meet and talk about that? Well, that's a different type of conversation. And when we fast forward to today, the types of projects, if you look at just on a pure commercial basis, are very different than the last cycle. It's not your strip mall. It's your data center. It's going to be $1 billion data center is much different than a strip mall on the side of a road. But the one thing I would not discount retail, if you go back to Texas, the TxDOT says whenever you build a new road, it's not just about transportation. It's about building business all around it. To some extent, you are seeing some building growth with that, but really what we're seeing overall is a different type of growth in commercial. And so the same contact said, listen, Kathryn, if I started all my projects today and I didn't get another new bid, I would be busy for the next 2 years. Now, part of that has to do with labor. He said, I could grow 15 to 20%, but I simply can't. Because of availability of labor and bottlenecks in the value chain, I can only grow 5 to 7% from a real volume standpoint. And so you're seeing delays mostly in labor shortages, particularly skilled labor. And also you're seeing, and it still gets down to a people issue, but permitting issues also are holding up projects. Right now, something that is really more unique to 2018, and we'll spend a little bit more about that in our building product survey, is you're seeing inflation being a real issue this year. And there are certain industries that have had consistent price increases over the years. The aggregate industry is a great example of that. The aggregate industry has had year-on-year pricing every year since the end of World War II, except for 5 years, and the biggest price decline was a whopping 2%. If you look at other industries like the insulation industry, they don't have stats that are even close to that. But this is a year they're actually getting pricing. This is a lot to read, but basically what is it saying? One of the biggest issues for delays is labor. And then you have some of the usuals like weather, but all in all, contractors are very optimistic, but they're also sanguine in that they can only grow so fast. Now, the Building Product Survey is a survey of the largest building product manufacturers, distributors, buying groups all across the US. And we look at a lot of different, very specific building product categories, but for the purposes of today's talk, we focus on some that are more commercial focused, or at least have a mix. So with steel studs and ceilings, it's pretty similar. I mean, same type of optimism, 80+%. I've seen volume improvements. Wallboard, which is a little bit of mix of res and non-res, is optimistic, perhaps not as bullish. But still, wallboard industry shipments came out today. In fact, this morning as I was coming into the presentation, and for Q2, we're up for about 10%. And it wasn't on necessarily super easy comps last year. So volumes are humming along pretty nicely. But like as we said, we talked about with the contractor survey, here you can really dig into by category what you're seeing in terms of inflation. And one of the biggest takeaways that we've had from a wide variety of contacts is inflation is just expected this year. It is not if, it's just likely. And also the timing of the increases is very indicative of the environment and expectations for inflations. Just to give you an example of an industry, so the flooring industry, so manufacturers would be like Mohawk and Shaw, the Berkshire-owned Shaw Industries. Typically, the flooring industry goes to market in January. That's where they get to talk about their new flooring product. And oh, by the way, I've got a May price increase. That's the way it's been for years and years. This year, December, oh, by the way, I have a price increase. Then they went to market in January. And oh, by the way, they have a price increase in May. Oh, and there's a fuel surcharge in July, too. And all of them were generally pretty successful. And so that gives you that's a real tangible example of a specific industry that has changed the timing for pricing. Another one more recently is the cement industry. So the cement, there's probably won't be a new cement plant built in the US in my career just because of the cost and the capital requirements and the environmental reg requirements. But the cement industry has kind of had its ups and downs in terms of pricing. For the first time in at least a decade, there is a mid-year price increase out in Central Texas. And that just hasn't happened in a long time. It all gets down to demand, availability, and also the inevitability of rising costs. I think what's also interesting, there's generally less pushback in the field. We think that will change. But at least right now, people have an understanding of the why behind their price increases. There's been a lot noted on the steel side, I get, but it's not just steel. There's other categories too. So this is a survey that we did of residential framers. And we like this simply because it gives a view of how it's from the laughable to the ridiculous to the sad. But essentially it says how are different regions of the US dealing with a labor shortage. Now, this does not necessarily deal with framers, but I'll give an anecdotal story of feedback I got from one of our aggregate relationships, his crush rock company based in the Southeast. And he was talking to one of his third-party trucking partners, and he said, we had a pretty good week. We typically have about 50 applicants. This week we had 12 that passed their drug test. Usually it's about 6. And that's something that, transportation in particular has been a significant issue this year. It was an issue last year, but now is part of the mainstream and continues to be an issue for the industry. Now, we've talked about inflation, we've talked about labor. What's this gonna do for the cycle? It's a question I've asked. If I'm asked once, I'm asked 20 times in a day. So we put it back to the industry. What do you think? And what's really interesting is that by and large, most think this is just going to extend the cycle. And really more so than anything else, they're saying, I'm okay, kind of like the commercial contractor I was telling you earlier, I'm okay not growing double digits. I'm okay if I have visibility and I'm gonna grow kind of that mid to high single digits, and I'll just have to deal with the inflation, because I think eventually it will turn. We generally agree with them, particularly given the visibility that we have in commercial, given the visibility that we have with particularly infrastructure funding. I think where the question is going to be is on the residential side. You'll see decontenting houses, smaller footprints, but at some point in time that will catch up. So really in terms of concluding remarks, just a few takeaways. I can't emphasize enough the Southeast and the Southwest will continue to see robust population growth. This is something that's very different. It's much akin to the population growth you saw to the Midwest at the turn of the last century. It's just something that we really haven't seen to a great degree. We think that states and municipalities will continue to find creative ways to fund their growing infrastructure needs. I can tell you it's not just at the state level, it's going down the municipal level. LA won the 2028 Olympics. In preparation for this, LA passed Measure M, which is infuses about $1 billion of funding just to LA County. So you're seeing it go from the state down to the municipal level. In terms of headwinds and tailwinds, inflation is going to be an ugly beast we're going to have to deal with for a bit. A tight labor market, I don't think, even with a cyclical slowdown, I don't think that labor will be fixed. It is still going to be an issue that's going to have to be dealt with. The other basic headwind is we're 9 years into a recovery. How much longer is there to last? But in terms of the tailwinds, and particularly for the regions as you're thinking about managing your business, you're still going to have that population shift to the Southeast and Southwest. We still think that the Panama Canal is going to be a driver of business in unseen ways for multiple years and multiple decades. And the energy industry, lest we overlook Texas, is still will benefit, and not just in Texas, but in other parts of the U.S. So with that, thank you very much for your time today, and happy to take any questions. Can't tell. Oh.
Sorry. Okay, we had a lot of questions, so I was just farming through some of these. A lot of good questions, primarily related to the current administration and their view on tariffs.
Wow.
So the question is,
how do you... that landmine.
Yeah, well, the question is, how do you see tariffs impacting our goods for projects? And as a follow-up to that, or another part of that question, what effect are trade wars and tariffs having on project spending plans?
Okay, so tariffs have not had an impact on project spending and plans yet, and that's keyword yet. The types of projects that would really be impacted, that are very large projects, are going to continue to move forward. So if you're looking at a 2 to 3 lane widening project from DC down into Central Virginia, that's not going to stop. In terms of tariffs, it's a really tricky, it's a very, very tricky line to follow. We do spend a bit of time in DC and trying to understand the landscape of this. We think it will fix itself. If there is one thing that is very clear with the current administration, they believe that the economy rules everything, and the minute they have any type of initiative that negatively impacts the economy and the voters that voted for them, I think they'll change their tunes.
Okay. Here's another question related to labor, and this question says, how is the labor shortage here in the U.S. affecting those U.S. companies that are building overseas projects that demand American labor or U.S. labor only?
That's going to impact mainly on the heavy industrial side, and that's a fair point. But if you look at the issue with labor, it's really multifaceted, and it's not just about what's happening overseas. There's a couple different areas that are being impacted. One is just the aging out in the construction industry. If you look at the Great Recession, there were a lot of there's a whole group of guys that were in, and gals, that were in the construction industry that just got out. They said, I can't wait 5 years to pay my mortgage or to pay my rent. So you have a whole group that just got out of the industry. You have retiring and an aging out of a group of population. Then you don't have enough newcomers into the industry. And a lot of that gets down to just pure education in the field, whether it's at the state or the community college level, and to some extent, immigration. I know there's a lot of focus on immigration, but I wouldn't say that that's the number one. I think the other factors are the bigger drivers, and then immigration is another factor impacting those things.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, and this one's pretty specific to Texas. I know that's a big representation here in the room. So this says, if Prop 1 and 7 in Texas were redirecting funds rather than setting new taxes, what were the funds primarily being diverted from that voters were receptive to?
So what were well, okay, could you, the last part of it,
Yeah, so really it asks about what were the funds primarily being diverted from that voters were receptive to for Prop 1 and 7 in Texas?
Yeah, so really, I mean, a lot of this issue is, TxDOT in particular, their funding was rated, and they were put into, it's a terrific question, and whoever answered that, I actually have a list of a variety of different things, and I hate to say it, I promise you, it was not education, and it was not healthcare. If you look at the two areas that were funding is rated first, it's actually those two buckets, unfortunately, and that's accurate for the state of Texas. I'm happy to get back to the person who asked that question to give the breakdown of that buckets afterwards, though.
Okay. Well, that's good. That's about the extent of the time we have for this afternoon. And again, I thank you for your speech, and thanks for your time today.
All right, thank you.
Appreciate it.